Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today. Because today we get to return to one of our most favorite fantasy series of all time. It could only be Joe Abercrombie's The First Law Trilogy. We return to the series today to talk about a character that has won the hearts of the fans, surprisingly enough. Dylan, do you want to reveal the character profile that we are doing today?
Right. Well, we're going to be talking about the Dogman from the First Law Trilogy. We ran a poll. We took to our wonderful followers on Twitter to see who they wanted us to do the next First Law character profile of. And we had, we've already done Galacta, we've already done Logan, we've already done Baez, and those are probably the most obvious ones that we knew people would want us to get into really quickly. And then we're like, who's next? And we threw out Giselle Dan Luther, the Dogman, Colin West, and Pharaoh Malgin. And, Charles, you and I had a little text conversation beforehand, and we both agreed that Giselle was probably the favorite to win the poll, just by nature of being one of the more frequent perspectives used, I guess. Like the three main characters of the original First Law Trilogy are usually considered to be Logan, Galacta, and Giselle. And we're like, okay, well, Giselle's the favorite. But I did say, Charles, I was like, don't do the Dogman dirty, because this guy has a shot here.
You did, but I don't think either of us expected him necessarily to win to the extent that he did. And I'm going to be honest with you, Dylan, I thought we were going to be recording a Giselle Dan Luther
we did
today.
Yes.
I was already starting to, I came up with the title and everything, we had already worked it out. It was on the schedule, but then the fans spoke, and they spoke clearly and resoundingly.
And we're listening.
And we are listening, so that is why we are more than happy to be discussing the Dogman.
Right.
So let's not delay any longer.
Can we delay just a little bit longer? So
okay.
The Dogman got 54.9% of a vote that had 4 categories here.
A resounding
just to put
victory.
That in perspective. That's huge. That is a dominant performance. Giselle only got 24.4%.
That's so crazy.
West got 9.8%, and Pharaoh with 11%. I'm surprised she beat out West.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that West was furious about that. And anyway, before we get too much into this, I'll be sure to give my spoiler warning, which is that if you have not read the First Law Trilogy yet, that is just the first 3 books of the First Law world, which would be The Blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, and Last Argument of Kings, then you might want to go back and read those because they're freaking awesome.
Yes.
And then once you've read those, then you might want to come back here. But for now, if you have not yet read the First Law Trilogy, now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones. Check those out. But for all those folks who have read the First Law Trilogy, let's get into this. Let's talk about the Dogman.
Very well said, sir. The title of today's episode is probably going to be something around this idea of Dogman, the price of loyalty. And that is just where we see Dogman's arc kind of going by the end of this, is that Dogman has aligned himself with different people throughout the trilogy, and by the end he is left to figure out what was this all for? What good did these causes do me? And that's what we're going to get through today. I wanted to focus our conversation initially on The Blade itself, book one of the First Law Trilogy. We don't get too much Dogman in this one. There's not
Right.
too much in terms
He's
of,
done
of
dirty
plot.
in this
Yeah, he's done dirty. Exactly right. So, I mean, standout moments, I would have to say, would be kind of the end, where this whole series is, you've got Dogman, Tall Black Dow, Three Trees, and they're trying to get by after just thinking, Logan is presumed dead. So they're just trying to um, head south and make a new life for themselves. And that's when they confront Bethod's tax collectors. They learn that the North is at war with the Union, and Team Dogman has this
Ooh.
knowledge of the Shenka, right? And they go, okay, well, if Bethod's army's heading south, the North will be undefended from the Shenka, and we have to do something. And it's that noble cause, I would say, where they're like, well, we need to be prepared to fight the Shenka. We need to go to Bethod, even though we had just been banished.
Right. Yeah, and the Dogman sticks out pretty early on among Joe Abercrombie's characters as being a, I guess, shockingly personable and relatable and likable person, where we're so used to these Joe Abercrombie characters who are extremely compelling, but also just seem like people you would not want to be friends with. Pretty bad dudes and dudettes. And I'll say that we have Dogman's he's kind of chill. Like, he's kind of just like the scout of the group at the start of this, and he's pretty much risen to prominence as Logan's sidekick, for lack. We did our sidekicks that stole the show thing, and I was kind of thinking Dogman might make sense, but he goes on to be so much more than that that didn't. It feels like it would have been doing the Dogman dirty to call him a sidekick.
Yeah.
But I think that he has, in some ways, had the luxuries for so much of his life of not having to be the person who's had to be realistic about these things. Mm-hmm. He's kind of been the person who was just supposed to do their job, and their job was, he's got a good nose, he's able to scout things out, and he does more of that. He's done a share of fighting, but never sought it out, and
no one has scores with him necessarily, and if they do,
Not
it's through his ties to Logan.
Right.
And you said something interesting. You said he kind of stands out as a Joe Abercrombie character, and what also adds to kind of Dogman's interest is that he stands out as a Northman too. Like, a lot of these Northmen right away, like when they realize Logan's dead, they're fighting over who should be in charge after Logan, and Dogman's the only one who's like, now guys, come on, like, we all know that Three Trees was Logan's second and all these other things. He's amongst Northmen, he's like a really chill, nice guy as well, and his personality kind of sticks out in that way from the rest of the crew. So it's not only as an Abercrombie character he's kind of interesting, but as a Northman in Northern society he sticks out as well, a little more of a sensitive type.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. He is a little bit more sensitive. He's just someone that you feel like anytime he has to do something really bad, he feels it so deeply. There's all these moments that come up for Dogman where he, especially when he does later on take on these more leadership roles where he has to, like, be in charge of, I guess, raids maybe is the right way to say it, that ends up with people getting killed. And every single time he dwells on those things. And when you compare him to a character like Logan, who, Logan likes to say to himself all the time how bad it is to kill people and he shouldn't be doing it, he wants to stop. But what's interesting about Logan, I mean, one of the many things that are interesting about Logan, well, how about I'll say it this way. Say one thing for Logan Nine Fingers. Say that once he's killed someone, he kind of just moves on. And he's like, oh, shame, whatever. And Dogman, it's interesting because we get more of these moments afterward where he's literally just like thinking about how much it was like a shame that this poor person who was young had to die and that kind of stuff. So he's so much more sensitive than even Logan, who can kind of make come off as personable, even if there's a lot of darker stuff underlying that. And like Logan's shtick is always this like, oh, am I a bad person for having done that? He's not really concerned, it feels like, too much about the people who are now dead. Dogman really cares. Like, he cares about the people who are dead. And I mean, if we're starting to move toward this, like, where does loyalty get you bit? Like, he's always really cared about all the people around him.
He's cared
too.
about the people, and he's cared about the causes as well,
Right.
which I think is what the Blade itself was getting at. This idea of these noble causes, and like you said very well that yes, Dogman is always trying to do the right thing, minimize casualties, minimize cruelty, and he's willing to risk confronting Bethod again
Right.
to do that. He's trying to warn the North about the Shenka because they're out on the frontier and Shenka are popping up like crazy. And so he's concerned that, hey, if the North marches south to the Union, you're leaving everyone victim to the Shenka. And they decide in those moments, this book ends for Dogman with going to Bethod's men and deciding we need to try and break bread with Bethod and warn him. And that's when they send Forley the Weakest to Carleon to try and talk to Bethod. And we all know how that goes for Forley the Weakest, which unfortunately they cut his head off.
Yes, that ends in poor Forley's demise. And Forley, it's a cautionary tale for what's to come in the First Law, when Forley gets his moment of nobility here, where he goes out and he's trying to do I don't know if loyal's the right word, but
certainly noble.
They did still hold some sense of loyalty to, I guess, like Bethod and almost even just like the North and humanity over the Shenka. And Forley is a person who says like, well, we owe this to them as fellow humans. And he goes in there, and it's Calder who actually does Forley and not Bethod per se.
Right,
but
it's Bethod's men. I don't think Bethod was there. He was busy talking with Baez.
Yeah, Calder, his son, is the one who deals with Forley in this way. But again, if this is kind of going to foreshadow some way that things are going to go for Dogman, it's this like, oh, the person trying to be loyal, trying to be courageous and do the noble thing here, they end up with their head cut off. And the Dogman, he'll fare a little better than that by the end of the First Law, but he's definitely going to pay the price of loyalty in many ways.
Yes. Well, what's interesting is Dogman's story ends in the First Law with him standing over a grave, giving a eulogy about Forley the Weakest, and this,
or you mean in the Blade itself?
In the Blade itself, right? And this, unfortunately, is going to be a trend for Dogman, and how the endings of each book kind of go for him. This is the beginning. I think you said very well, Forley's the cautionary tale. We all know what Joe Abercrombie thinks of this idea of being noble in the world of First Law, and this is that first flavor that we're getting. And Dogman, there's a moment where he thinks to himself at the end of this book that he's kind of the coward of the group now, and
without Forley there.
Without Forley there, and that is what you said, this idea of cautionary tale of like Dogman is going to have to face certain dilemmas in these next two books, and how he fares, will depend on how he's learned his lessons from Forley and so forth, which brings us into Before They're Hanged.
So, yeah, and Charles, am I correct that Before They're Hanged starts with a Dogman perspective? Is the first chapter? Do you remember?
I don't remember as fact, but I want to say yes.
If I was remembering correctly, Before They're Hanged stuck out to me as the first and last chapter were... I can check my Kindle copy at some point while you're talking. But I think the first and last chapter are actually Dogman chapters.
I believe you are correct.
And that's very interesting, because because I remember the Blade itself, we felt like he's one of the more underutilized characters.
For sure.
And then, and that's where this phrase "doing the Dogman dirty" started coming up, was because you and I hardly talked about him in our The Blade itself episode, because like he's kind of just this view in The Blade itself of what's going on in the North, and he's this relatable person. You see how battles are fought and that kind of stuff, and you get his perspective on Logan. One of loyalty for sure, and and then before they're hanged, we get a lot more Dogman in Before They're Hanged, because things are starting to really go down in the North.
Right, there's a lot of action that takes place in Before They Are Hanged, because where we are now is the gang is trying to, once they realize that Bethod is not going to listen to reason, there's no more reason to be loyal to the North. They're like, well, the enemy of my enemy, right? So they're trying to go over and join the Union, but the Union just sees a bunch of Northmen and tells them to get lost. So it's not until they stage this little ambush of Lord Marshal Burr that they finally get recruited by the Union, and they are assigned to the same division as Prince Ladislad and Wes, Colin Wes, which turns into a really fun, interesting part of the story where Wes is getting adopted into the Northman society. You know, it's a lot of fun to see that play out. So the gang discovers Bethod's army by circumstance, and of course Prince Ladislad, trying to be noble and brave, refuses to listen to reason and charges into battle.
Yeah. It's generous to say that Ladislaw was trying to be noble and brave. He was trying to be something, all right.
He was trying to be a war hero, yeah. And there's a bit of nobility around this idea of being the dashing war hero, like Glocta, right? So,
yes. Oh, yes, that was Ladislaw's big thing. He kept, like your friend Glocta. Shame he's dead, West.
Yeah.
And what? I'm sorry. We don't want to do the Dogman dirty.
No, we do not.
Stay focused on Dogman here. So, we get these interesting interactions with Dogman and West, especially, where I think those two characters, they seem to like get each other in a lot of ways, and this is in part because they're in kind of similar situations in Before They're Hanged.
Oh yeah.
Don't you think, Charles?
Yeah, I think these two characters are really interesting to compare, and we touched on this a little bit in our Buddy Read episodes. Like, I kind of stumbled into this realization during those episodes, but when you compare Dogman and West, they're kind of opposite ends of the same coin. Dogman sticks out in the harsh northern society for being a more sensitive guy, and Wes is the opposite. He sticks out in this kind of sensitive society by being this harsh character. So they understand each other in that way. They're both kind of these fish out of water, based on who they are as a person and what their society is like.
Charles, you're blowing my mind, Charles, because this isn't the way in which we compared these characters in Before They're Hanged, because this feels very new to me anyway. Or maybe you said something.
I said this in an episode.
You said this?
Yeah, I made this point.
You did?
But not as clearly as I'm making it now, but if we go back and rewind the tapes, I did make this point.
But
I'm saying it
for
more
some
clearly
reason,
now.
it's registering a little bit more what you're getting at.
We had like 2 hours straight of recording. We were just like, can't stick on that point for too long, too much plot. So now that we're focusing on Dogman, we can expand this conversation.
Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of like this thing where I see you getting on this already, Charles. Like, West has these almost like more barbaric, furious. Yeah, he gets a name, like these angry, intense impulses, and his plight in a lot of ways is to try to figure out how to temper that into to be able to fit in and be an adaptive, functioning person in a union society that values, like, quote unquote civility. Like, they have all their backstabbing and all this kind of stuff, but at least like this appearance of civility, like dressing nice, being like even if you're kind of being rude under the surface, like saying the right things. And and Wes is obviously also a commoner in a society that values like being of noble blood and things like that. And he's kind of got to keep it all under wraps and keep it together, but he's like repressing all of this, while
Yes.
the Dogman's is coming from the opposite direction. He's this really, like you were saying, Charles, sensitive, like personable, kind person who, if like he lived in a different place, probably could just be like a very normal dude going about his life, doing whatever. Probably if he never got wrapped up with Logan, he'd probably be doing that like on a farm or something somewhere in the north. And what he has to do is be able to like step out of that and learn, even in some ways, from people like Logan, to be like realistic about things and be a little bit more savage and like willing to do what, like the ruthless thing, in order to survive and get by in a northern society in which war is the norm.
Yes.
And yeah, and it's interesting, I think, a lot of times where it's like Dogman applies a lot of Logan's lessons in a way more like, for lack of a better way to put it, like a moral way than Logan does, because Logan has all these like great little sayings that could lead you awry if you use them as rationalizations, or could lead you well if you're someone like Dogman who kind of needs to hear, like, yes, we know you care a lot, but sometimes you have to be realistic about these things.
Very well said. It's true. And that's just like the Dogman is so interesting in that way, and Wes is so interesting in that way. I think those are two characters that kind of get a little overshadowed by some of these other characters, but they're two of my favorites for this reason. There's so much going on with them in the background. It's like, man, you take the time to think about these characters directly, and you start to come to these realizations. And like, who knows if these two characters were born, like if Dogman was born in the Union Society, who knows? If Wes was born in Northern Society, he'd probably be, as bad as Black Dow. You just don't know, but it's interesting to think about, and it's just the circumstance. One of the things we do get to see, Dogman kind of has this chance at a normal life when they meet, or Charles, not really a chance at normal life, but go ahead.
I want to say more about the West Dogman stuff.
Sure.
I think so. The thing that stuck out to me about the West Dogman parallel from the last time we had the conversation was that they were in very similar situations, I guess. Or did I say the last time we had the conversation it was that they were in very similar situations was the thing that stuck out to me. And that was in the sense that Dogman was basically trying in a lot of ways to keep the peace between two very kind of, to various degrees, like ruthless, barbaric folks in terms of Tolduru and then Black Dow.
Yes.
Like more like classic northern folks who are more in touch with their like...
And Polder and Croy for West.
Right. So Polder and Croy for West, though, are kind of the opposite, where they're like all in like the picture of noble, like bluster with no sense of actually wanting to do anything, I guess. Like, so it's kind of like we have these two setups, right? Like Polder and Croy are like, they almost need someone to just be the like, no, we have to go like do a thing. Like we have to be ruthless and relentless and just like take action here, because they'll sit around and wait for a letter from the king forever. And then this probably is more last argument than is before they were hanged, but whatever. And then you have these situations with Dogman placed between the two more like typical Northmen in Tolduru and Black Dow, who need a voice to be like, oh no, like we need to chill, we need to get along, we need to...
They're like kind of trying to bridge the peace and keep things moving. They're the ones trying to get things done, but they're not the leaders. So that's true. And they do both fall into leadership positions, which is also
and in part because the things that make them different from the typical person in their society is kind of what is needed.
It's keeping
in
things
opposite
moving,
in opposite ways for the two, because they're they differ from their society in terms of West being more furious than most in the society, and Dogman being more sensitive than most in his society.
Right.
Is like part of what helps them rise to their respective tops, because that's the voice that's needed.
Right. And another comparison is that they're both interested in the same woman, which
Right,
is that
Cathal.
of Cathal. Of course, Cathal goes to Wes and says, "You're too angry for me," and chooses the Dogman, which is a very interesting choice. And it's the kind of the last thing I want to talk about in Before They're Hanged, because this is a super interesting point for the Dogman, because this is where he's starting to realize that there was a life before all the scores and all the allegiances and all these things. You know, he's in bed with Cathal and he's remembering the last time he was in bed with a woman. It's like, oh, it's the last time I was warm or happy. But then what happens? I got dragged off and exiled with Logan. So his allegiances are pulling him away from his relationships. And Dogman is still learning that lesson in these moments, but he's reminded again of what an alternative life could be to pursue relationships and just be happy.
Right. And there were plenty of folks who weren't so closely attached to Logan but had fought on the same side as him, and of course Bethod, for long periods of time, well before the story that we're reading begins in the Blade itself.
Right.
And it is Dogman's just taken for granted intense loyalty to Logan that has him tossed out with everyone else here, even though he's a very likable guy. So it's like, and the key thing to remember about Dogman from this perspective of loyalty is something that makes him different from all the other characters that are following Logan, is that all the other ones are following Logan because he fought them in a duel and spared their lives, and that made them basically like Logan's underlings.
Right.
Dogman is just Logan's friend who came up alongside Logan while Logan was rising to prominence as Bethod's champion. So Dogman doesn't have that same sense of owing Logan in terms of his life being spared, or in terms of like the rules of the North say he has to serve Logan. Right. He literally is serving Logan and this is unlike any other characters. He's serving Logan because he is loyal to him.
Yes, and that distinction has to be made by Abercrombie. It's so critical for this idea of loyalty, because Dogman, in the end, he's wondering what was this all for, and if he was forced into it, it wouldn't be as impactful of a question. He has to ask, why was I so loyal to Logan, and then to Three Trees, and then to Wes, and then back to Logan? Like, why was I on the side of the North or any of these other things? And that's a really important distinction, Dylan, that you brought up, and it's a necessary one made by Abercrombie, because
but
that's
implicit.
What makes it so interesting. Yeah,
implicit.
Yes.
That's the thing. That's part of what is so incredible about Abercrombie's character work, is he has such a deft hand, and he really trusts his readers to figure this kind of stuff out. Like, you don't. I've read the series a few times now, and I don't ever remember a line that says like, and Dogman thought about how, Toldur would have had to serve because he was, he lost to Logan, but Dogman realized that he was loyal just for the sake of loyalty. What was that about? It's like, Abercrombie is going to trust you that you're going to figure it out, because he believes in his readers, and he's been rewarded by that, because, his readers do believe he has incredible character work. And this is a beautiful, we'll get to when that last argument chapter for sure, which where Dogman's reflecting on like what was it all for later. But yeah, it's
setting
so
it
good.
up,
yeah,
and
it's setting it up.
Further exemplified when the Shenka kill Cathal, basically, and it's such an emotional scene where she's still alive and she's scared, and they realize they have to pass the arrow through, and it just ends up being too much for Cathal, and she dies. And it was such like a it was almost like a stray arrow. You kind of get the sense of, it was like a chance thing that she got struck,
Right.
and it was almost like a senseless kind of death, and that's another important distinction in these moments with Dogman is a lot of the stuff doesn't make sense when you think about it. He's there. Why? Because he was following Logan, and then he was following Three Trees, and then they just decided to go with the Union because there was nothing else to do, and they needed to fight Bethod, and like, why do they care so much about Bethod? And now he's lost this one sliver of happiness he was able to carve out for himself, and this book ends with yet another memorial service, both to Three Trees and to Cathal, and Dogman gives a very emotional eulogy to Cathal, and then Grimm steps up and gives the eulogy to Three Trees. So it was just that was such a really impactful moment. It's kind of like the Empire moment for Dogman, where he's like, man, I've lost everything. This is so depressing. And he hasn't quite asked himself, what was this all for quite yet, but he's getting there.
Yeah, that's so well said, Charles. And I know you're talking about the eulogy, and I have a quote here that I think is relevant, which is from the great Hardin Grimm. Doesn't say a lot, but when he says it,
you better
this
be
guy
listening.
says it. Yeah, when he says it, it's time to listen.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things he says in that eulogy is, he says, great leader, great friend, lifetime of battles, stood face to face with the Bloody Nine, then shoulder to shoulder with him. Never took an easy path if he thought it was the wrong one, never stepped back from a fight if he thought it had to be done. I stood with him, walked with him, fought with him, 10 years all over the North. It says his face broke out in a smile. I have no complaints. And that is about loyalty too. It comes from Grimm, but we see it through Dogman's perspective, and it's seen to be this thing of like, isn't that so grand almost in some ways that we had such an incredible leader in Rudd Three Trees, and I do think Three Trees is one of the like most noble people in the First Law series.
That's fair.
No way he makes it through, and and we get this moment where the way that he is lionized by Grimm is talking about how Grimm felt so great about being loyal to him. And we go on to, like, we have Dogman seeing this and seeing, oh, isn't that such an amazing thing to be loyal and to have others loyal to you. Mm-hmm. And I think what'll be interesting to see then, especially when we think of what ends up happening to Grimm in the last argument, how he ends up dying, also in a pretty senseless way, to think about from the idea of this price of loyalty with Dogman, both the price of Dogman's loyalty to other people like Logan, like Three Trees, but also to start exploring as he takes on these more leadership roles, start exploring what the price of like other people having loyalty to the Dogman is. And I think Grimm will be a good person to chat about there.
That's well said. And Grimm kind of sees his life at this point as a bonus. He's more simple than Dogman. He's not as pondering or philosophical as Dogman is. So he's like, I enjoyed following Three Trees and it was all fun and he did a good job and he should be happy. Dogman is getting into relationships and is a bit more sensitive, and his thoughts on the matter are a bit more complex than Grimm's, but that's super well said. This is definitely, obviously, the loyalty theme coming through in these moments, and to hear Grimm explicitly state that at the end of this book is like, the whole arc coming to a close for the blade for before they're hanged, and it was one of my favorite moments. Like that last moment. Battle, that going into the funeral was some really amazing payoffs from the whole series in those moments. It's really exciting stuff. So that brings us into the last argument of Kings, and what happens here is Dogman is the new chief. Tulduru and Dao, the Black Dao, they can't decide who. Like, look, we couldn't listen to the other. There's just no way. As long as one of us is alive, we can't be in charge. So it's got to be you. And Dogman, like, this is news to Dogman, but everyone else already knows it, right? He's the last to know that it's obviously him. So that is kind of a humble beginning for Dogman, and he takes to it pretty well. And this is what you were talking about, Dylan, at the beginning, when you were talking about how he was trying to limit bloodshed and reduce as much violence as he can and avoid conflict as much as he can. And we see that very explicitly in these early moments of Last Argument of Kings, where he's sparing guards and, giving the leader a chance to surrender. And he's taking cities with minimal casualties. He's telling Black Dao not to, go loot the city. Like, chill, Black Dao. Just because we took over the city doesn't mean you get to go crazy. And, people are listening to him. And these are the moments where we get to see, hey, this is what the North could be like with someone like Dogman in charge. It's very different, but it's a place that leaves room for less bloodshed.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to see that a character who rises to a leadership role, almost in this case, by nature of not having had as commanding a presence.
Yeah.
Because it's literally the way he ends up to be the chief is because the two obvious choices without three trees are Black Dao and Thunderhead, and those two hate each other so much and are such commanding presences that there would be a giant schism if either of them were to be the person in charge.
Right.
And you just can't have either of those. And both of them are at least realistic enough to know. Both Tulduru, Thunderhead, and Black Dao are realistic enough to know, like, well, no, that neither of us could work. So that's why they think of the Dogman. And then the Dogman ends up as this, you said fish out of water earlier, Charles. Fish out of water leader. But weirdly enough, this is the guy who is doing such a, like, I don't know if better is the right word. Probably it is. But like a certainly more merciful way of like treating other people and how do you take cities.
Bloodshed
and how
is
do
a priority for you. That it would be better.
Yes, that is well said, Charles. So let's say better. That the Dogman does an outright better job as a leader than
and everyone
any others,
likes him.
Really,
the issue that Logan had was people are following him because they're terrified of him. But the minute he goes back to the Union, everyone that stays behind is like, well, forget that guy. Logan can only command people within arm's reach. That's his issue. But
maybe sword's reach.
Yes, sword's reach.
Yeah.
But Dogman
arm especially, but sword too.
Yeah, but Dogman can actually lead all of these people, and they're all kind of like, yeah, you know what? I'm okay being commanded by Dogman, which he's probably the only person besides Three Trees that was able to pull that off. So that's something to be said for certain for Dogman's leadership capabilities.
Yeah, and I do think this is where we start seeing Dogman grapple with the questions that like the two-sided coin of the price of loyalty, where it only used to be this, what is the price of my loyalty to other people, but now he has to think about what's the price of other people being loyal to me, and what are the choices I'm going to make given I have their loyalty.
Very well said, and that continues to be tested as Crummocky Fail enters the fray.
Beloved of the moon.
Beloved of the moon.
No, only one more beloved, and that would be the Bloody Nine.
That's right. And then you also, but I do also want to say Logan returns to the fray, and that's kind of fun too. You get reminded that these characters have history, and I love the back and forth they have about Shivers, who also enters the fray in these moments, where it's like, Rattleneck's son, isn't he? Nope, the other one, but isn't he Count the Winters? Oh yeah, okay. Like you get the sense that these guys all had this history.
They've been around a while.
Yeah, they've been around a while, and you get the sense too is almost kind of like an old hat for them. It's like, aren't we just tired of this? And they've asked that question a few times now. It's like, when can we retire? Like, are we actually going to affect enough change that we feel like we've had a job well done and can put our feet up and all these other things? They've all kind of had those conversations leading up to this, and Crummicky Fail comes in. It's like, this is the last big score, guys. we can do it. And then they're all like, okay.
And he puts them in a tough sitch, Charles.
Yes.
In the end, does Crummicky Fail?
To put it lightly.
Yeah.
They go on this super long 7-day bloody siege, just trying to defend this crummy hill with no strategic value.
Nice, nailed it.
Thank you.
Maybe Crummuck.
Very crummicky hill for sure. And they somehow managed to survive long enough for the Union Army to arrive, and somehow the plan works. I mean, it cost them Talduru.
Thanks to Furious.
Yeah, but Furious helped them out for a price. And they managed to chase Bethod back to Carleon, where we know the siege happens. Logan fights the Feared, and Dogman, in the shadows, goes and kills the sorceress. I'm not confident on how to pronounce her name. Carib? C-A-U-R-I-B? Carib?
We need Stephen Pacey on the line.
We do need to consult Pacey.
The great audiobook narrator of Joe Abercrombie's First Law.
Brilliance.
Carib?
Let's go
whatever.
with that. And that's a fun scene also, but doesn't speak too much to Dogman's arc other than, he wasn't
He's very loyal to her for a very brief portion of time when she has him under her spell. I don't know, Charles. Maybe if we dug deep into all the things that our English teacher, Mr. Miller, taught us about looking for looking for symbolism in literature, maybe we could find something to do with how Dogman follows unquestionably that moment with Carib when she puts him under his spell and literally go kill your friend, and it's Grim is the friend, and I think it's Black Dow who then kills
because Grim and Dogman
Carib.
are like, oh, you want us to stab each other? Okay. and they're agreeing to everything she says. It's Black Dow who just splits her head like a melon with a battle axe.
Yes, Charles, the person who never really struggled with being too loyal, Black Dow.
No.
And we see that for sure in the end. So it's it's interesting that Grim and Dogman... Here, Mr. Miller, I hope I'm making you proud if you're listening.
You're doing a great job so far.
Yeah, so here's the thing, Charles, right? The two people who are completely obeying Carib and her powers are the two people who've always been very loyal and very followery to these more powerful figures throughout their lives in Grim and Dogman. And the person who is able to resist that is...
I don't know if it is resist as much as
it's more he snuck around.
Yeah,
I know, Charles. Yes, but come on, don't.
I'm just clarifying for the listeners
each other.
I'm clarifying because there's those, we are targeting First Law, deep lore First Law fans now, so we gotta be clear.
And we send. Black Dow is more able to do it in a literal sense by nature of he was sneaking around and he gets behind her. But if you think of it more from the literary sense that Mr. Miller would want us to think about, then maybe, just maybe, you could say that it's interesting that Black Dow, a character who's never struggled with loyalty, is the one who solves that problem.
That's well said. I'm going to try and make our English teacher proud also here. And I will say that Abercrombie's also making a statement in this scene, Dylan. He's making a statement that there is no room for relationships in this story, even one forced by magic, between this infatuation that Dogman and Grim have with the sorceress.
Oh my God.
Because then you have even the forced connection coming together through Carib's spells cannot survive in this world. Dogman cannot sustain a relationship without duty getting in the way. And that
for
is
you, the listener, in case that any of that was unclear, that was just Charles making fun of me. For
It's a valid,
for the listener.
It's a thing
sure.
that happens. It's not
you making
strong,
fun
but
of me?
you challenged
Yes.
me to come up with an extended metaphor here, and that's what we did.
Yeah,
and,
that's Charles making fun of me and Mr. Miller.
and you know
so
what we did?
Let's
it was
keep
coherent.
It,
It was at least a thing, but that happens.
More
but
coherent than you expected, Charles?
That's absolutely correct. And
all right, let's keep this moving.
So
let's not do the Dogman dirty by doing this.
We get the whole Logan versus the feared thing done and over with, and then what happens? Logan kills Bethod, and Crummicky Fail just kind of sneaks in and is like King of the North, and somehow Logan, after refusing the chief role, now accepts the king role.
Yes, and Charles, can we mention too that when we get Logan's perspective of the Dogman in charge, there's some sort of Charles in charge joke I could make if I were quicker on the draw here.
I guess
but
you could.
I don't have it, right? But when Dogman is in charge, Logan reflects on this, like, oh, wow, he's doing so much better than I ever did in that role. We definitely want to keep it that way. But, push comes to shove, and somehow Logan floats like a leaf down to Carleon into Scarling's chair, I believe.
Right. And Crummicky Phil is just starting the slow chant, like, King of the North. King of the North. And he built up the momentum, campaigning for Logan. And anyway, that's what happens. And Logan's like, now we march to the Union for another battle. And this is
as you do,
where Dogman is like, okay, what? And
yeah.
and half the North also, they're like, do we need to? Wasn't the whole point to dethrone Bethod? Aren't we done now? It was like, well, we owe a lot to the Union, and there's all this stuff happening, and I really like killing people. It's not Logan doesn't really realize that, but that is what is happening. And you can listen to our Logan episode where we get into that, but that's his subconscious being like, I just like to fight, that's all I know how to do, even though he doesn't think that. His justification is, they helped us, we helped them, let's finish this completely, they need us, whatever. So begrudgingly they all go, and Dogman now is kind of over it. He doesn't care about the Union at all. He's like, didn't we do what we came here to do? And that is only exemplified, or that's only kind of punched home when they actually start fighting in the Agreement, and they have to fight Agrion, thank you, and they have to face off against an eater. And poor Grimm dies in Dogman's arms. And this is such a tragedy that Dogman, I don't think, recovers from.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. And that's what I was trying to sort of hint at with the earlier stuff about the price of loyalty being a double-edged sword, I guess.
Sure.
Where this is a point where Dogman has seen many, many of his friends die. We know that. But Grimm feels a little bit different for a few reasons. He's almost like... It's hard to call a person who kills other people an innocent, but it does, as Abercrombie characters go, like Grimm, because he's so silent. You can tell he is kind of well-meaning. It feels like he's got a little bit of that an innocent vibe.
Yeah, he's along for the ride. He's just happy to be there,
He's happy to be loyal to whoever's in charge. And in this case, yes, it's Logan, but it's also Dogman, and it's been Dogman in a lot of ways for Last Argument of Kings. And I think he feels a level of personal responsibility for being the person who Grimm was being loyal to, and dragging Grimm all the way down to the Union there. And this moment is kind of, as we move toward the end of Dogman's arc, maybe the real thing that I think you mentioned some of this already, Charles, drives home this point about what the heck, what is all this for? Why did this guy follow me? And why did I follow Logan? And why did we all go down here? And why is he dead now? This is all pointless.
I think it's really poignant at the end when Dogman is alone now. Logan is like, I need you to stay here. Someone needs to be the northern diplomat for the Union. And Dogman's like, okay. And Logan walks away and Dogman's left standing there. And everyone else is gone. Black Dow is up in the Union, but everyone else is dead. So, I mean, up in the North, and everyone else is dead. And Logan's heading up to the North. And that is important because all of the best times that he had were with his crew, and now his crew is gone. All of his best times were with whenever he was in a relationship, and all those people are dead. And now he's in a land he's never been in before and is told to stay there. So what was he working towards this whole time to now be alone and have no purpose and have nothing in a land that he's never been in before? It's tragic, really.
It is tragic, Charles, and I have a quote here from the Dogman's last POV chapter that I think will help establish what you're getting at, which is it was a long journey that Dogman had taken the last few years, and a strange one. From nowhere to nowhere, and he'd lost a lot of friends along the way. Oh. He remembered all those men gone back to the mud. Harding Grim told Duru Thunderhead, Rudd Three Trees, Forley the weakest, and what for? Who was better off because of it? All that waste. It was enough to make a man sick to the soles of his boots, even one who was famous for having a flat temper. All gone and left Dogman lonely. The world was a narrower place without him.
Oh, man.
And that's before Logan comes up to him, and that doesn't exactly make things any better. But
no,
yeah, that's kind of where
Dogman's like, we're basically not friends anymore. I'm going to do what you say for some reason, but we are not friends anymore. And Logan kind of accepts that, unfortunately, but that's where they end. And it's so tragic. Poor Dogman. Like, that sentiment is like when he's feeling it in his soul and reflecting on all his dead friends and admitting that he's lonely. It's like, what powerful moments happening for Dogman right now. And it's a good question. All these characters died doing for a cause, and is the world a better place for it? And that is a huge thesis for the whole First Law trilogy. Every character kind of goes through this. What all these struggles that we're having, what are they for? For Dogman, he ended up in the same place, just lonelier. For a character like Jazal, he finds out that he never did anything that mattered ever, and nothing he ever does will matter because there's people playing the game at such a high, out in the stratosphere of what he's capable of. It's all these things. And even Glock is like, well, maybe we get to implement a few nice things along the way, but it's almost kind of like there's the senselessness to a lot of it that is what the First Law trilogy is kind of trying to highlight about humanity and politics and like this other side of it that's like it's all pomp and circumstance. In the end, it's you're left alone. It's the tragedy of it, and that's the whole point of Dogman's arc.
The point is the pointlessness.
Yes. And it's kind of funny when you were like the beginning of that quote was like he started and ended with nothing. I'm like, that's kind of like how the plot goes for the whole trilogy, right?
And once upon a time, Charles, you would have called that a criticism, but I think now, because it's about character arcs and all that, it's, I don't know, the plot going from nowhere to nowhere in some ways is the point,
exactly,
I guess. And
yeah.
it's so well established, and when you see it through that lens of like this is how characters, I don't know if learn is the right word, but like go through things that then give them different perspectives and in some ways like give them different perspectives temporarily and then have them return to their old perspectives. It's like there's so much to gain from all these arcs, but to not do the Dogman dirty, Charles, I have a little bit more I want to say about his arc in particular, and ways in which, Charles, I think that the Dogman really parallels the reader experience around loyalty, especially to Logan. So I think that like so much of when we're in the Dogman's perspective, when Logan's not around, and in that point, like during the times before we see Logan come back to the North and really become the Bloody Nine again,
Mm-hmm.
he's just thinking about how, like, oh, wasn't Logan such a great man who had
Yeah.
all these like awesome sayings, these
Yeah.
things that still stick with me, and I still think like, wow, he really had all these great moments.
Right.
And he's kind of part of what builds this like this idea of Logan as, oh no, of course he's a good person. The Dogman seems like a good person, and he's always saying how like he looks up to Logan. And instead of us being able to see that that's like the Dogman's unreliable perspective because it's like he's kind of unnecessarily loyal to Logan, and he ends up learning that along the way. He has a like rosy, a Pollyanna-ish view, Charles, of who Logan is, and it colors our view in part as readers. But our view as readers is also covered by the fact that we're alongside Logan for this long ride of Logan rationalizing to us and telling us all these things about how he's trying to be a good man and blah 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 blah. And it's kind of like the Dogman starts to realize a lot of these things alongside the reader in Last Argument of Kings when Logan comes back to the North and then starts kind of like showing us, no, this is how he was actually acting that whole time when he was being Bethod's champion and when he was like being a leader in the North. And we end up in this place with Dogman after, if you want to hear us talk more about Logan's arc and all that, definitely check out our Being Realistic About Logan Nine Fingers conversation. But we end up in this place with Logan where at least you and I, Charles, start seeing him as like a person who at an observable level is trying to be like for what he can observe about his own behaviors and actions, like trying to be a good person, but is really like a very bad person in terms of what he ends up doing.
Yeah.
And we end up with this place with Dogman where, much like the reader, maybe he thought that Logan was such a good person all along, but he's by the end like, wait, no, this guy's a terrible person, and almost questioning his own judgment and, of course, loyalty to Logan especially, and just like how he should think about loyalty in the future. And we get this awesome line from the Dogman in his final chapter as well, which is basically he took a long breath of the cold wet air and he frowned down at the earth over Grimm's grave. He wondered if he'd know a good man from an evil anymore. He wondered what the difference was. And to me, if we're talking about loyalty and the Dogman, just the reader experience of like what happens by reading this series, it just undermines both Dogman and our own understanding of what a good person is, because a lot of us thought Logan was a good person for so long. And even like what is the difference between a good person and a bad person, and does it even matter in a world as gray as Joe Abercrombie's? And I don't know, I think the Dogman illustrates that so well.
That's really well said. When you find yourself in the wake of mass violence and losing people, you're just kind of like, what happened? Like,
right.
Did what changed? What hasn't? What's real? Like, what's going on? That's such an honest reaction.
What's good and what's
have.
bad?
Yeah, not knowing. And there's plenty of people that still like Logan. The idea that Logan is a bad character is a bit of a hot take.
A bad person.
A bad person.
We think
he's a great character, but a bad person.
Yes.
That's still kind of a hot take. And Dogman's not even 100% sold. But when he's asking those questions, it mirrors the reading experience, like you said, super well, because a lot of readers feel that way, that Logan, it's just better to do it than live with the fear of it, like he's saying all these things.
Changed my life, Charles.
Series. Yeah, and then but at the end he's like, what's happening now? Like, why am I friends with this guy? Is he good? Is he bad? Does it even matter? Like,
right.
And that's kind of how I felt finishing the series for the first time. I was like, what happened?
Yes.
Like, was this good or bad? did it matter? Like, what's going on? And then when I read it a second time, this whole series, expecting that, and then seeing what the story is about, it really opened up for me.
Yeah.
So in that way, with the Dogman, like, I needed to process it a little bit more to figure out what was going on. But you still end up with this kinds of purposelessness of all the violence.
For sure. Yeah. Yes. Purposelessness and definitely that I think the like almost general, almost nihilistic in a lot of ways feeling of the First Law series, or at least the First Law trilogy, is a reason why it gets labeled grimdark so much. Is like, while a lot of extremely dark events happen in lots of series that don't get labeled grimdark, it's this more step back philosophical cynicism and almost nihilism that is what makes, in the end, like Abercrombie, Lord Grimdark.
Yes.
Like, and that pointlessness, the difference between good and bad being almost like arbitrary and in some ways irrelevant in Abercrombie's world in some ways, is like, that's, I think, just a piece of this greater like pointlessness of a lot of
which we get into like, the different flavors of it through these different characters.
Right.
But it's the Dogman is the one that kind of blows it open for the reader of like, okay, what was the point again? He is the parallel.
He's the reader experience,
yes,
man.
And he's why he pulled so strongly in the poll.
Yeah, it's making more sense, I think, to us after talking about it. It's like, wait, why is the Dogman so freaking popular? It's like, because probably he's the person by the end of it that most directly like seems to be seeing what we're seeing as readers.
And
just stepping back and being like, what was this all?
Is it that he won the poll and we were surprised? It's kind of like Dogman would be surprised too. He'd be like, wait, I won the poll? What?
It's like,
it's
Giselle. It's like, well, Giselle, everyone thinks he's a narcissist, so they didn't pick him. And, Pharaoh and West just would be like,
they're too angry.
They're too angry. So we ended up going with you, Dogman.
It had to
be
you.
Like, it's like, okay. So, yeah. And Charles, I don't know. I had a lot of fun. I think I didn't realize how much fun it would be to talk about the Dogman.
That's fair. Say one thing about you and me, Dylan. Well, you can't say one thing, and you cannot say that we did the Dogman dirty because we gave him a lot of time today, more time than we were expecting we would. But
that's true.
This conversation just opened up. I agree with you, Dylan. My experience recording this episode was the same. It was a lot of fun to talk of, always fun to talk about the First Law, but we didn't really get as much chance to talk about Dogman in the buddy reads and to do all Dogman discussion. We had a lot to say.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that we can just walk away from this and say that we did the Dogman right.
I would hope the same thing. And thank you to all the listeners who made it through and to all those people on Twitter that voted to hear this episode.
All you Dogman fans out there.
All you Dogman fans out there. I thought we were going to do a Giselle episode, but you know what? He can wait. We'll do him very soon, I'm sure.
He took this one on the chin, Charles.
That he did, sir. Well, unless we have anything else to say about Dogman, I think we're ready for that sweet, sweet outro music. What do you say?
Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music rolling, Charles.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. This has been your co-hosts, Charles and Dylan. If you like what you heard today, if you want to enter some Twitter polls, join the conversation, influence our next read, go ahead, join us, follow us, be part of the discussion on Twitter over at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. We are also active on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast, and you can always send us an email at the ftfpodcast@gmail.com. Now, Dylan, if they were listening on Apple Podcasts and they wanted to further support the show, well, what can they do?
toss 5 stars to our podcast. All you gotta do is click on that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app and scroll down past all those episodes until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the best number of those to click if you want to help support the show would be 5 of them. If you're feeling like you have some extra time and you want to support the show even further, then writing a review helps us so much. But just listening is more than enough. We're so appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. You guys are awesome. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.